with the children's hour program. Are you sitting comfortably now again? Those of you who are old enough to remember. Looking at this mixed bunch here, it's interesting in fact, and I've just been very quickly running over some of the links between Ireland and Armenia, given the fact that Helen is pure Irish, and whatever that is, and so am I. We look back on back to the 4th and 5th century, where tradition has it that the Armenians travelled to Ireland. How much we have that for truth, I'm not very sure, but there is some evidence to show that. And then we have the fact that there have been quite a few studies done on the likeness of the Irish Celtic crosses to the Armenian patch cards. I've actually been to a lecture given by somebody from London University who drew a lot of similarities between Ireland and Armenia. And then, of course, there was the famous or infamous Mr. Lynch, who wrote in the last century, who wrote a double-volume book on his travels in Armenia, which is actually quite a very interesting historical book. And then we look back to probably here, 30 years ago, in Ireland, where you could probably have numbered Armenians on, if not one hand, certainly on two hands. And now we've got a relatively larger community. We're not sure of exact numbers, are bandied around, certainly in the hundreds, in the low hundreds. And we make up, or they make up, along with the Irish, an interesting mixture. Helen is Irish, as I've already said, and is originally a photographer. And through her work, which she will explain how she came in touch with Armenians, who, of course, as I always say, seem to get everywhere. You always manage to meet up with Armenians, no matter where you are. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing her work, which is for which she's actually now studying for a PhD, looking at links between items of household items and things of Armenian background, particularly in Western Armenia, and she'll explain just where she's been working, and now with the diaspora, particularly in London and Paris, and now to some extent also in Manchester. It gives me great pleasure, Helen, to actually meet you along that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. And by the way, can I just say, if anyone wants to look, there's some really interesting things that Margaret has brought from her past, as it were, embroidery and a brass tray. So do have a look at them afterwards. Questions, can you remember what they are and ask them at the end as opposed to in the middle? Anything else you should say? I think that's about it. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Ireland. So you're all very welcome. I'd like to welcome the community and members of my family who have very nicely turned up today, which is brilliant. I have a little problem in the sense that I'm not hearing very well at the moment because I have a blocked ear. Nothing dramatic, just wax. So that's why I'm using the microphone as well. And so you may have to, when you're asking me questions, have to speak up a little bit, which might be necessary later. So you see this title, Memory in Pipelines. So actually, what I'm going to start with is how recently, but not so recently, we're talking about 2007, I found myself in what is historic Western Armenia, and what is known in contemporary world as Eastern Turkey. But actually, my links to the Armenian community go back to the 1990s when I taught English at San Lazzaro. Do any of you know San Lazzaro in the Venetian Lagoon? And it was there that I felt, well, first of all, I didn't know anything about the country, and I worked as an English teacher, and I became fascinated with what is, there's a country that somehow all their symbols were in another country, Mount Ararat, the ancient city of Ani, and how was that allowed to happen? And I went there in 1992 for the BBC, did a piece for the World Service. And then that was it. For many years I've been photographing in ex-Yugoslavia, doing many other issues, women's rights in Morocco, lots of issues for Amnesty International, other events, photographs funded by the English Arts Council. And eventually I got a grant, and I was living in Paris for the past 10 years. I got a grant from the French government to take part in a residency there in 1996. So it's only when I decided to do my doctorate that I came back to this subject. But I'd already been there in 2007 photographing on this pipeline. I don't know if any of you know about it, called the BTC pipeline. It's a BP pipeline funded partly by the Turkish, Azeri and British government, and it avoids Armenia, but it actually goes through the historical heartland. So I wanted to show you some of this work, and then that will lead into my work with the descendants of the exiles in Paris and London. Okay? Are you all with me? All right. So I woke up one morning in a place called Ardahan, which is in eastern Turkey, western Armenia, in the highlands. And I was looking at this house and thinking, you know, everything there was very modern. I had a look at this house, and, you know, even when something is negated or forgotten, there are traces. And this was to feature later in my work. And of course you can see here the Armenian writing on this house, dating from 1911. And this is actually the pipeline that goes from Baku through Georgia, eastern Turkey, down into the Mediterranean, and then eventually the pipeline goes up to Europe, up to the port of Trieste. A colleague of mine in London has written a book about that, James Marriott. And it really, when we were giving a presentation about this together in London recently, we were talking about the fact that even though the pipeline avoids it avoids Armenia, contemporary Armenia, which is only 10% of the original Armenian heartland, if you like. This pipeline goes through historic Armenia. And we were at the time photographing the ecological devastation and the lack of compensation for the mostly Kurdish farmers in the region. So there's the traces of the pipeline, as you can see. And this is actually in Georgia, in a region which is known for its mineral water, the mineral water of Barjumi. And in fact, this man's house had been destabilized by this pipeline, and he'd received very little compensation, if anything at all. And so that was a whole series of work that I'm showing you just a snippet of here today. But it sort of backgrounds the idea of, you know, even if a culture has been disappeared, the legacy of it continues in the contemporary landscape, and also in the communal memories of the people. This is a Turkish activist, actually, who works with the Kurdish population to try to get them compensation for the ecological damage. And he's also very active in trying to prevent Armenian churches being destroyed, in those that are left in eastern Turkey. Because when we talk about genocide, we can also talk about cultural genocide. And I was at a conference in Yerevan in 2010, and there were many speakers speaking just about that. You know, that you can, the process continues, basically. And this is a piece I did connecting the work of James Marriott on the right with this activist, Farhad Kaya, and it was a whole series I did for the British Arts Council in 2007 on the pipeline and its connection with the people whose lives have been affected by it. This is a double exposition, you know, when you put two legs together. And this is a Georgian man whose house has been destroyed by this pipeline. And this is the sort of it's the landscape of just going up to the Georgian border, very snowy landscape, you know, in the winter in the high lands of Western Armenia, Eastern Turkey, what we call today Eastern Anatolia, if we want to be politically correct, in Turkey. And these are Kurdish villages. Probably they would have been inhabited by Armenians a long time ago. But you can see the effect of the pipeline is that it doesn't bring economic wealth to a lot of the villages. And this is a photo of a lady whose house has been destabilized in Azerbaijan as a result of this pipeline. And I'm just holding it up in front of BP headquarters in London, from where the trouble comes in. This is the pipeline. Okay, so then in around about 2009, I had this idea to work on a doctorate, because through photography, I was living in Paris, where I'm still half the year in Paris, and I wanted to connect this idea of, objects, stories, and their links with the memories of the people that have been left behind. The memories of the people whose ancestors had either been killed in 1915, which was, for those of you who are not familiar with Armenian history, was the first genocide of the 20th century. But unlike for the Jewish or even other populations, it was not recognized by the perpetrators. It was recognized by the Allies, if you like, after the event. But because the use of the word genocide only came into force in 1945, and because contemporary Turkey has a policy of negating this, the descendants of the victims of the Armenian genocide have had to live with this very heavy history. And it's like what French philosopher Carzou has said, it was the perfect crime because it was said to have never happened. This is a quote by one of the writers who deals with this. And so this is the grandfather of one of the ladies I'm interviewing in Paris, and he was the governor of a town called Zeytun, which actually in Arabic means olive, right?
Yes.
Some of you speak Arabic because you are Iraqi Armenians.
Yeah.
And his name was Nazareth, and he was killed. Basically, he was killed defending the town. And I went to the town in 2011, and I tried to find, part of what I'm dealing with are the traces, the visual traces, and also the objects that families have. And here you find the remnants of the old Silk Road in Zeytun. And of course many trees with pomegranates. And orchards with figs and pomegranates. It's actually a very beautiful place. But I had heard many stories, and the stories form part of my research, and the recordings I make form part of my research. And it's interesting looking at trees, which I'll come back to again in the later work, because you have the trees, of course, survive. Maybe the people don't survive, but the trees survive. And this is the fountain of Zeytun. And you can see actually these Armenian symbols on the fountain, but the text has been obliterated. Because now in this town, the story is told from the perspective of the Turkish victors, if you like, and they say that they were the victims, so they turn history on its head. But many of the community, especially if you go further east, the Kurdish population, there's an increasing awareness of what their ancestors were involved in, and I will speak about that later, about how that's changing the perspective on this recognition. So you can see again traces of the Armenian symbols. And I suppose they could just be symbols of any culture, but you would know them to be Armenian, right? Because of the particular importance that these symbols have in your life and your identity. For example, we can see this one here, which is not unlike, it's interesting what Isabel said earlier on, is not unlike a Celtic symbol as well. And on the left, I've juxtaposed two images here. You can see the remains of a church that was the church of St. Hovannes. Zeytun, by the way, had a population that had come initially from the city of Ani, on the border with now contemporary Armenia, a city at one point of 1,000 churches in its history, and which, as you said, Lynch had visited in the late, we're talking about 1880, 1890 time. And this is the mountain in Zeytun. So it's a very beautiful region, and that's on the way up to the what is now a village. Again, some pomegranates. Okay, so with some of the ancestors of Armenian exiles, they allow me to photograph them. They are not afraid to use their real names. They feel that, okay, time is passing, I'm getting older, I want to tell my story. And so this lovely lady is Seta Tahan Belajikian, and her ancestors came from Diyarbakir, which is in Armenia known as Tigranakert, named after the Armenian king Tigran. Okay, and this is her photographed in Paris in her very nice apartment, actually, and she's reminiscing about her family. And these are her ancestors. In fact, her mother is the little girl in the centre, in the very, as you can see, very nicely made coat, type of fur type coat, you know, she looks very, her name is Takuli. And this family actually were photographers. Her grandfather, Bohos, on the left, you see they're all wearing the fez, apart from the brother in the centre. These were the Serafian brothers. They were some of the most important photographers in the Middle East at that time.
Yeah, we have Serafian by the way.
Distant cousins, we didn't know we had distant cousins.
You didn't know you had distant cousins? Okay, so this family, we think this photograph was taken in Diyarbakir because they opened up the first photography studio there. And they later went to the Lebanon and they became very well-known photographers. In fact, when the Middle East was opening up, they were photographing all around. And they were wealthy, they were Protestant Armenians, because in Diyarbakir you had, and even still today, I'll talk about that in a minute, you had the Catholic, Orthodox, and the Protestant Armenians. So this family is Sarafian, and Saraf means money exchanger. Okay, this is Diyarbakir, as you can see, Mesopotamia, before 1915, and it sort of looks like a fantasy imagination of the Middle East in the positive sense, I think. And you can see at night time it gets to be 100 there in the summer. Very hot, it's the place in that region in Mesopotamia where it produces the biggest watermelons, okay? And it's the river Tigris that goes through this city. It's now a city of 1 million inhabitants, and it's the unofficial capital for the Kurdish community. A lot to be said about that too. This photo was taken, and many of the photos of that time were taken by the missionaries who had their role in educating Armenians and who were very important in telling stories about what happened in 1915. So you can see in the distance, do you see a church spire? This is the Armenian Church of San Giragos, which had the biggest, the highest church steeple, in the city. You also have, and I must think this is very important, an Assyrian Christian population in Diyarbakir as well, who survive, some small community survives to this day. But the church steeple was dynamited in 1916, after the events of 1915. Okay, this is today what it looks like. Again, you can see the traces of the old houses. I know it's very hard to see from here, but you can see the courtyards. Yeah. There it is. And there's my microphone. And actually, the Armenians in Diyarbakir were known for their silk. They produced a lot of silk. The mulberry trees are very important in of course, the production of silk, but also they were merchants, they were traders, they were...
Tooth, I just want to say tooth. We have a lot of it in Armenia.
Yeah. And in the background you can just see the plains of Mesopotamia. Again, I use photographs a lot, and I'll show you what I do with some of the old photographs later. But as I said, Madame Belagikian, she allowed me to use some of her own photographs, which was very generous. And this is her grandmother with her son in Diyarbakir. And her grandmother was called Anna Tufenkian. And Anna Tufenkian loved to dress in traditional costume as well. And apparently when she left before the genocide, she decided to bring many of her servants with her because she loved them so much, and she really was a true native and nationalist, if you like, from Diyarbakir, and this is her dressed in the traditional costume. And that's a picture of her projected onto an old Armenian house in Diyarbakir. So I had this idea, you know, to use, because I'm a photographer, to use the photographs themselves and maybe use some of those images and project them back onto the buildings to sort of bring back the image, and I wonder what does that do, you know, because of course I'm not the person who experienced this loss. I'm the person who's, I suppose, transmitting memories, other people's memories, and telling stories that are other people's stories. So I have a different role, you know, and I'm questioning that in the research. What is my role? You can give me some feedback on that if you like later. But inside the old walls of Diyarbakir, which is called in Turkish Surici, and remember they speak three languages there. They speak Armenian. Well, some people speak Armenian. It's being revived a little bit. They speak Assyrian. They speak Turkish, Kurdish, and they also speak another language called Zaza. And the Zazas also have been persecuted. And also the Alevi community, who are Muslim, but they don't use the mosque. So this is inside the old city of Diyarbakir. And this is before the church, I should say, the one I showed you earlier on in the old photograph, San Giragos. It was the biggest Armenian church, not biggest church, people make the mistake, biggest Armenian church in the Middle East. And this was the, when I first came there, which was, I think it was 2011, this photograph was taken, where they had not begun any restoration, and this was an original mosaic. And then it was taken away, and we never saw that again actually. I don't know what happened. And this is a photograph taken in the churchyard. It's of a mulberry tree, and the light was particularly good on that occasion, on that day, because I came in and I felt very emotional being there, and I thought about all what had happened there in this church, and what it meant to the people, and I took the photograph. But the church obviously is very, the tree is obviously very old. And as I said, all over inside the old houses of Diyarbakir, you have these trees. And then I decided to focus on this particular area because it was somehow telling me stories about the past, or traces of the past. And in these houses, it was hard to get the keys to these houses, I'd have to wait around before I would photograph them. And some of them were still in use. I have to say that inside the city walls of Diyarbakir, in that particular area, it's still referred to as the infidels' quarter. Not by the politically correct population, in the art population, the artistic population, if you like, of Istanbul, the cultivated people, but by the local people in Diyarbakir. It's still referred to, in this very controversial way, as the infidels' quarter. So there's a long way to go, I think, in terms of recognition. But the local council in Diyarbakir has tried, they are working with the Armenian community in Istanbul to uncover the past, basically, let's put it that way. So these houses are old Armenian houses in Diyarbakir. And you can see then that the people who live in this area are mostly people the Kurdish population in this region have been fighting the Turkish population, if you like. They've been mostly involved in a resistance movement against Turkish nationalism. And this particular part of Diyarbakir is where they've been able to find housing, because it is full of abandoned Armenian houses. Okay, so you have in my photography, you have this layering. You have the original community and their traces, and then you have how these houses have been given to them, and they are living there, but they also have the traces of the Armenian existence. And they're actually very lovely, if you like, inside these particular houses, because you have this feeling of enclosure, and you can imagine what it would have been like in the past. You know, they would store their watermelons down in the basement. They all had these stairs, and they had a very enclosed kind of lifestyle. And when I talk to the descendants, they talk about that. They talk about this, you know, that they lived in the region. You know, that they didn't go out, for example, even though they were Christian, they didn't just go out without covering their face. They had to go out with a veil. Now, today it's not like that. You know, there's a whole other dynamism going on within the region itself. But at that time, even if you were Christian, you had to protect yourself. So this is another Armenian house that is like this today. And these are the back streets of this particular area. And this the city of Diyarbakir has walls that go back well beyond the Byzantine region time, and they have several gates. And this is one of the gates which leads to another town called Mardin. And you can just imagine that maybe it was one of those gates that the people would have had to pass through in 1915. There's a process now of restoration going on in the city. And, you know, you could be cynical and say, is it just for tourism? How can you actually restore without recognition? So this is the debate. And the mayor of this town, Abdullah Demirbaş, he is very involved in trying to get recognition. But it's rare, you know. This is only in this particular place that this is happening. But there is a consciousness of what happened. This is the church which is now being restored. This is just one of the windows. Again, the family, and one of their objects that it's a silver cane from one of the from a cane handle. So this was photographed in Paris on the left, and this, of course, you've seen the other photograph before. And this photograph was taken in the old forgery in Diyarbakir. It's of an old man holding an axe handle. You know, and you can ask me about that photograph later, but it's hard to tell a story about such such history, really. Anyway, it's a photograph taken in the old forgery, which would have been where we had a large Armenian presence in the past. And then this, I went to many different places as well. Of course, I went to places like Marash, which were known for their embroidery. And I actually worked with some of the Armenian community from Aleppo in Syria. And we found some of their families' houses, okay. It was very difficult to, to actually decipher if this was the original house. But one of the girls I worked with, she had taken some embroidery that from her ancestors and brought it with her, and we just placed it on the door. This again is back in Diyarbakir, just to show you the level of devastation of this particular quartier, or this particular area. And this is a former Armenian house in the center of Turkey. Kayseri?
Yeah.
Yeah. yeah, it's a little from a little village, and I, you know, could recognise the particular architecture of this town, which had a beautiful church, etc. And you know, they invited me in, and I took the photograph. So it's interesting how the houses are still lived in parts of the region. And then, you know, if you travel a lot there, you find in some villages, you still find some Armenian churches that are protected by the local Kurdish community, because perhaps they had, you know, they were converted in 1915, forcibly converted. Basically, if you don't convert, we're going to kill you. So their ancestors had experienced this, and so some of them had converted, but they kept the churches. It's quite rare, but some of the churches in the little towns. This is a town called Derrick, okay? And this couple, they said they were Armenian, but they were half and half, you know? Okay, so they were basically protecting the church. And when I took those photographs, I took them in black and white, as you can see. We had tea, we talked, we went into the church. There was an original Bible there as well. And this is in a place called Enclosure, which is now called Gaziantep. And this is the original Armenian church, one of them, which is now a cultural centre. And this is one of my friends from Aleppo, Tigranoui, and she came with me to visit her, to try to find her ancestors' house, and these are her ancestors. And this is where the house used to be, okay, which is now a garage. And here she is. She's actually very happy to be in the old Armenian quarter, and at the moment she's not so happy because she's in Aleppo. Yeah, so we're in contact by Facebook, funnily enough. This is the streets. And this is in Eintep again. You can see that parts of Eintep were closed off after 1915 because, you know, obviously it's that whole thing about history, you know, when you're can't deal with the past, you know, if you can't deal with the past, you somehow hide it. But these houses have survived, but they're overgrown. Those are old Armenian houses right in Eintep. And this is the actual original Armenian church in Eintep, which was designed by Balayan, and he's the same architect who designed the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. And it's been turned into a mosque. It was also a prison for political prisoners. And this is some of the landscape of one of the families I'm working with. It's the region of near to Marash. It's a beautiful region, actually. And this is giving you, just before I open this up for you to ask me further questions. This is the region of Lake Van, which was, of course, as you know, the centre of Armenian identity and culture in Western Armenia. And this region just is so beautiful. And this is a church that still survives on the island of Lake Van, and it's called Kuduz, which means beak, right, in Armenian, and it's Çarpanak in Turkish. And you have to go there by boat. You have to hire a boat. It costs $100 basically, and you go with the family, and they bring you there. And it's very remote. It's not Akhtamar, which is the most well known, but it's, as you can see, probably because it's on an island, it survived, because so many of the beautiful old churches have been destroyed. There we go. And there we see Mount Ararat, which is, for those of you who don't know the Armenian history, this is one of the great symbols of the Armenian identity and culture, and you can see it from the Armenian capital, Yerevan. But here we have it from the other side, if you like, looking across this remote landscape at Ararat. And now this takes me to, because obviously when I wanted to photograph this, I had to, you know, the whole story is so, well, what should we say this? The diaspora and the landscape itself is vast, you know, and I wanted to go and explore as much as I could. So I went to Ani. Ani is, as you know, on the border with contemporary Armenia, with post-Soviet independent Armenia. And this is the river that divides it from Turkey. Again, this city was very important in the Armenian identity and culture, and was at one point, until the 10th century, on the road and the part of the world. Of course, some of the churches that survive are in bad condition, some are in better condition. You can still see some frescoes, and these are the walls of Ani, which have been very badly restored. This is the cathedral on the inside. You can see the lovely stonework. Again, some of the churches. And this takes me back to Lake Van, and where we were earlier on with those photographs. I went to the village where the painter Arshil Gorky, does anyone know about him?
Yeah.
So I went to his village, and I asked the villagers, you know, did you know that there was this famous painter that came from here? And they said, no, we don't know anything about that. But we have some, you know, we have some things from the church. So they took out these stones with crosses, and these come from the church of the village, which was destroyed. And this is another lady I'm working with in Paris, and she would like to be anonymized. In other words, she doesn't want us to know who she is because, you know, it's her right. Everyone I work with, they sign a contract, you know. Basically, it's very important for their protection, their identity, whether they want their name to be used, their real name, or they want to be anonymized. And this is the Bible, again, from her ancestors, which comes from Diyarbakir. And this is her grandmother. And you can see again just some other things from the town. Again, the embroidery is very important for those families. This is photographed in their Parisian apartment. And this, her father had kept the image of the church tower in Diyarbakir, the one that was destroyed in 1915. They've now restored that church, and they've built one which is actually smaller, because of course it's lower than the minaret on the mosque. And this is my friend Tigrani with one of the embroideries from Marash, and they've continued that tradition in Aleppo. So in effect, the Syrian Armenians are, as you probably know as well, the nearest to the original homeland, and they have very strong links and often speak all the languages of the region. And this is the river in Zeytun, and that is there we go. Okay, so thank you for listening to me.
Sensitive area for all Armenians. I would like to ask you a question about the people you have met, particularly Kurdish people who were living in the houses of Armenians who were killed or exiled. Do they realize how much their ancestors were involved in genocide? Because Kurdish population also was involved in genocide in some massacres. Do they know about this history, or they don't recognize that, or they don't want to accept that it happened?
Okay, so did everyone hear the question? Yeah. I think it's it depends on the family. Okay, in Diyarbakir, which is now 1 million over 1 million people. So roughly the size of Dublin. The municipality is headed by the Kurdish Democratic Party. It's called the BDP, and they have apologised for the genocide. Okay. Now, whether this actually infiltrates into all families, I can't say. But you have a politic of resistance against Turkish nationalism. Certainly, I would say that. And some of the, and I'm working always through a translator, so some of the people do believe, yes, that their ancestors were involved. Some of their ancestors may not have been involved. But I think the real issue is that they have so many problems themselves. It depends on their level of consciousness, and it depends on whether they've taken the time to study this. But in general, there is an acknowledgement of the genocide in places like Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey, but only in a few places, I would say, and also within certain circles in Istanbul. So I can't answer for each individual family, but it's a very good question. Thank you.
Thanks again once for this wonderful photos and memories, and this reminded me of an interview I did with my father in '92. Just I wanted to know a little bit about his life, about my grandfather. My grandfather was a Catholic Armenian in Besni. Did you come across Besni? Which is Besni. It's now quite a big city, near Marashi area. But also in that city, they had also like the Armenian Protestant and also the Rusava-Chagans, the Armenian. It looks like my grandmom was Rusava-Chagan, but my granddad was Catholic Armenian. And it's very interesting to see how it just comes back with all that I've seen. I just almost want to go back and want to do something in that area. Because he did describe to me about their church, the Catholic Church, Armenian Catholic Church. Obviously Dad was 6 when, he was 6 when he was exiled with genocide. He lost the 3 sisters. But he did talk to me about the church, their church, which was but must be my granddad was quite open, so he used to also, he said he took me to the Protestant church, which was nice and bright. Well, it's amazing that the memories stuck in his mind. But very interesting. But all these brings back the memories, as you have shown the landscape. Dad spoke about it.
And many places there is as well. That's the other thing we're dealing with. In terms of, there have been, there's been a lot of research, but you can obviously buy publications that give you the original Armenian name and the Turkish name. So when you go and do research in Eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, you'll probably need to have a book of this nature with you. And this is why my research costs me so much money, because I have to hire a translator, and a driver I don't drive to, which is my own fault. But anyway. And so and often the original name has been forgotten. So it reminds me of the whole issue in Ireland as well, with names changing because of the loss of language. That a name doesn't mean the same anymore because we lost the language. And that is the situation too. Also, you have the added problem in Turkey is that the alphabet changed from the Arabic, right, to the European alphabet, and so people also, when we talk about memory, they themselves can't access a lot of documents that were written at that time. So it's a complicated issue, and we're coming up to 2015, and it's all going to be very painfully reignited for you all. So hopefully, there will be some more movement on this issue.
Sometimes the shape of the cross indicates about the type of the church, because whether it is Armenian, Catholic Armenian, or Orthodox Armenian, because the shape of the cross, which is similar to, for example, the shape of the cross of St. Patrick. St. Patrick and Ireland, they had a certain shape of the cross with the circular part of it indicates St. Patrick and the Irish Church. And when you go to the Mesopotamia, which is the area between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, you will find so many rites, the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Nestorian, and you can distinguish between the ruins of the church from the shape of the cross, because each of them follow a certain shape of the cross, and that shape is related to their religion, and especially the monotheism, and more than that, and the Catholics. For that reason, you can indicate from the ruins of the church which type of church is that.
Just no, I don't need a microphone. I'm just making an assimilation. I've known Helen for about 20 years and watched her studying the way she's done various things. And just, it starts, I think, for me in Iran. I know quite a lot about Iran. And it filters, which is Persia, and it filters down through Syria today, Turkey, the whole region. I don't think America, you know, I'm certainly not anti-American, but I don't think they'll ever get a grasp on the ancient history and what's going on. And I think today, what's going on in Syria, it just, because Helen just mentioned Aleppo, people didn't know that from the news, but people are so busy with petty little economies, life, and various things, and you know, and we're living in an electronic age. Is great because it's great for communication, and you can research things and get things. But I think it's all to do with, you know, ancient histories, because Iran was Persia, and you know, I have friends who were Bahá'ís, and they left for Iran, and they were persecuted. So there's been a lot of persecution in this area, and there's a serious lack of understanding in Washington D.C. and in London and in the major capitals about stuff like that. And I think when you have that lack of communication and lack of understanding, you're not going to be able to, you know, deal with these questions. And I think the whole question of the EU and Turkey, like the Byzantium, it raises complicated questions, and it goes back to the Serbian and Croatian, and you know, when the wall came down in Moscow and decisions that were made by Churchill, it's a layer of 100 years. It's a very big layer, and I think it's all intertwined.
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you, Hannes, for your contribution. Yeah, of course, it's a complicated region, you know. I mean, I have photographed in ex-Yugoslavia, and I think that's interesting as well, because I don't think it's so much about religion. I don't know if you agree with me there, but it's about how religion is used by powerful forces to, you know, instigate their own agenda. And this is what happened in 1915. I think with the Young Turks, they used religion against a minority Christian population. Okay, that's really what they did. And you know, you can, at any time in history, these things can happen. And so, but I think the issue, I think that's really difficult for the Armenians is the healing process. Because how can you have a proper healing process if you don't have recognition? I went to a talk on Friday by Richard Carney at the Abbey Theatre about memory, you know, and he talked about the scars and how you have to heal these, that you have to bring them out into the light, and you have to be able to move on or move forward. You know, you have to have some sort of recognition, and that's why I think this particular issue really grabbed me as a photographer, because, you know, how can you say something didn't happen when it did quite clearly happen? There's evidence, you know, and henceforth I thought that that's a good subject area to work through with photography, the seen and the unseen, and all of that. But yeah, it is complicated, and the whole region is complicated, and there are many minorities who suffer in the region. So I think we need to, in a way, show solidarity with, for example, I mentioned briefly the Assyrian Christian population as well. You know, they've recently tried to get recognition of their what's happened to them, and I think that's going to come more and more. And the more minorities will come forward and push for their rights, then that whole question of, you know, is Turkey going to first of all, get into the European Union, and we have to decide whether we think that their values are values that we can understand and appreciate in terms of, recognition of the past and human rights, etc.
About recognition, I'd like to.
I think other people may hear you.
About recognition, it's just maybe, I think, my opinion, wishful thinking. Even nowadays, I think something like 5-6 years ago, Turkey was involved in destroying a very historic cemetery in Nakhichevan.
Yeah.
Just nothing happened worldwide, no
Oh,
complaint, no anything, whatever. So just even now it happens, as we speak, it happens.
Yeah.
Never mind in the past or recognizing what has happened in the past. Just some more thing. Another thing you mentioned there in your lecture about restoration. I don't think they are particularly interested in restoration, so they don't need to acknowledge what it was like. What they are possibly doing now is renovation, modernization. It's very easy to go and change doors, ceilings, anything that I'm sure if that pattern continues, 50 or 100 years time, you won't see Armenian alphabet on all buildings. Very easy to remove few stones, replace it, or kind of go and cover it up, change doors, change ceilings, change whatever else, as if it has always been like this. So it's renovation more so than restoration, I think.
Yeah, except that in some places they have tried to do, they have worked with the community.
Maybe that not up to a point, only 1 out of 10 or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think that it's an easy issue.
Yeah.
Some places have been.
As we say, we say in France, c'est la vie. We have to get on.
Of course, it's very hard to be optimistic, but I also think, when you're talking about something as deep as this, and when something does happen, it's important to recognize it as well, even if it's just a tiny little gesture, because that's important. That's a beginning, in the process of reconciliation or recognition. I agree with you that often restoration is used with whatever community is used not as a means of uncovering the past, but of obliterating the past. You're absolutely right there.
About that, I've heard that in Armenia the walls are being restored and the lions of Armenian kings have been removed and the crosses. So, can I ask a very simple question? We've learned that there are 3 islands in Lake Van: Lim, Katutsi, and Akhtamar. Did you see Lim at all?
No, I didn't have time. I went to see Akhtamar and
Katutsi,
yeah.
but not Lim.
Not Lim. Thank you.
It's okay now. What was it? Any questions?
I have
Or here?
Yeah,
I just want to do a quick one. So you went to all these areas.
Do you want to have?
Is it? Are all those areas open for researchers or photographers like you? Is it easy to travel there? Were there any people trying to hinder or stop you, or or try to direct you where to go or where not to go?
Okay, mostly you can. I'm using this microphone because of the mirror. Mostly you can just go wherever you want, but there are certain areas which are under military control, particularly near to the Iranian border. And one of those areas was it's a beautiful church, actually, Church of Saint Bartholomew. So it's right up near the border with Iran. You're talking about, so it's east of Lake Van, okay? That area is under military control. I tried to photograph the church, but I was told impossible. You can if you get permission from Istanbul, but that would have taken days. So some areas are military zones and you can't. And actually, up until about, I think about 7 years ago, to photograph an Annie, you had to have permission from the. In fact, I don't think you could photograph. So you could say, from that perspective, it's easier to research these days. But there are certain areas which are military zones where some of your important churches are surrounded by military occupation. You know, it's the Turkish army territory, basically. Yeah, but mostly where I'm researching, you can research. But I think the problem there is also how to explain what you're doing. You know, I mean, many I know Armenian who actually he's a Californian Armenian. Do you know about him? I went on part of his trip. He brings Armenians from the diaspora. He calls them pilgrimages, and he brings people on tours of the region.
From America.
He's from California, and he's great, you know, because he speaks Turkish. He's you know, when he goes into a hotel, he's greeted. He's very popular with the people. He explains. He's open. He explains it, and it's sometimes very painful. I've seen people. I've been on a section of his tour where people are crying, where people. But he says himself that it's a sort of liberation in a sense, you know. I mean, I can understand why some people couldn't do that, you know. It's too painful. But for some people, it's some sort of liberation. Some people who I've met on one of his tours, they continue to send me photographs that they've taken of their town where their ancestors came from. So it's a question you have to ask yourselves, you know, could you do that? Would you want to do that? Would you be brave enough to do that, you know? And I could say that, well, for me it's easier, obviously, because I'm not Armenian, you know. But would you do that? Would you put yourself in that position? That's a question you have to ask yourselves.
Yeah, I think they're at a really good advantage by not being Armenian.
Yeah,
Yes, really good advantage. I think there'll be.
Thanks a lot. It's really a great contribution to the recognition of the Armenian Genocide, actually. Look, as a non-Armenian what's your personal opinion? Do we have a chance that the genocide will be recognized in the future sometime? Because as an Armenian, we believe we fight for that, actually, you know. But you as a non-Armenian, what's your personal opinion on that? And also, what should we do more than we are not doing now to get recognized, actually?
Of course, obviously I can't foretell the future of this issue. But I think there is more and more in Turkey itself. People are discovering that maybe their grandmother was an Armenian. They say there's something like 7 million people who have Armenian heritage, that it's coming through, because I don't know if you read this book by Fethiye Çetin. Her grandmother was Armenian. It's just called, the book is called My Grandmother, and boy, is that a powerful book. I mean, it's because of books like that as well that I picked up the subject as a photographer, and I identified, you know, this is what we would call an emotional identification for me. And I do feel that in the future it's like you can't keep burying memories. You know, even if you think about your private life, yeah, when something is hidden, and it eventually has to come to the surface, you know. And I think that it's a process. The more they try to hide those things, the more in time people, and I think it's really important. Professor Richard Carney said that, you know, narrative, family history, they are the real history, if you like. You know, that's why I think it's interesting working with family history. It's not facts. It's not based on rationale, if you like. It's more emotional. But if all these histories, if people tell their stories, if people create artwork about it, if people go and photograph, that's all part of a healing process as well as part of the recognition process. You see my point? In Ireland as well, we have this legacy of burying the past. Imagine what it was like during the Irish famine. You know, and imagine, you know, if we relate that again to the Jewish Holocaust, how on earth are you going to deal with such painful memories? So the first generation maybe can't speak about them. you know? And maybe it's the second and third generation that can speak about such crimes against humanity. So I feel in the future that it will have to be recognised, really, and that we should put pressure on government, you know, to recognise it. Because really, at the end of the day, if they were to recognise, and as I said, you know, that particular Kurdish party have taken a step forward in recognition, and they should be recognised for having done so, yeah, and they're pushing that forward. And the reason why they are, I think, I can't speak for them, but it's because they themselves have suffered from nationalism, and the effects of extreme nationalism are fascism, right? So I would hope that in the future that would be the case, that this would be recognised, because I think it's, you know, the first genocide of the 20th century. And even if the word genocide wasn't used until 1948, that word, you know, is important for the Armenian community to be used in the correct context of having destroyed so much and taken so much territory that was theirs as well. You know, so I would hope, and I would say to them, you know, you would only go up in the estimation of the world if you admitted to, not that you did it, but your ancestors did it. I think that's the key point. And there are Turkish historians like Taner Achin, who's, you know, who are doing that. But unfortunately, the Turkish government still pays for a propaganda ministry, you know, they pay historians to negate this issue. So, you know, it isn't an easy answer, is it, you know, to that question.
We have Armenian words for describing what happened. Let's make a genocide, that's murder, which has different meaning. And all the historians, they should use that, and they do use. So when you say together, it's just a separate from genocide and other person heritage. It's something more closer to Alpha. Should be different terminology. When they use that terminology, it will kind of liberate even Turkish historians to use it, I mean, for recognition what happened.
Isn't that what Obama is using as a
Yes. The word should have different kind of meaning.
But
do you want to explain?
And includes everything, genocide and Holocaust. No, that's it.
I think the EU really need to accept that, because Turkey can't go into the EU without Prince Charles, you know, apologised for the famine and for Ireland. I don't think Turkey, I have nothing against Turkey. They're great people, but you know, after Turkey, it's gone through history, there's problems there at the moment. There would have to be a complete openness and an admission of Armenia and all this before, because Europe wouldn't work. It's meant to be a big society, 400 people, a free society, but you know, you can't have hidden genocide and hidden things like this lady, you know, then there's wars to cover, and it covers 100 years. We've come through a lot, come through communism, come through everything, you know, and Armenia got tainted with Moscow, and you know, we all know the dollar was the currency during Moscow, and America was probably involved. They were all involved, you know. The whole thing is quite complex.
I'm just finding other questions, and feel free to colour Helen over a cup of coffee or tea. There's plenty more cakes and biscuits to eat before you go. I would like just to say both a personal and communal thanks to you. It's fascinating, really interesting, and what interested me is that I recognise a lot of the places and a lot of the stuff that I've read about. Sarkazan took a group to Eastern Anatolia last autumn, and we would have loved to have gone, but it was just too expensive, to be quite honest. I don't know if he'll do another one, perhaps he will, but I would like to be in the queue. But I'd like to just give you a little something on behalf of the Mission Parish Council.
Thank you very much.
And also say that you've been more than welcome to come back, and do keep us updated, please, on your work. And you get to the stage of you giving an exhibition or something of your photographs and your writings and etc., please bear us in mind.
And if you need any access to historical documents in Armenia, any archives or anything, we can help you with that. Thank you very much.
Helen has got a website as well, so you can follow her up, those of you who are internet active.
Helen.
And thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me here today. It was a very positive experience. Shad Shnur Hag Alan.